on the one hand, have extremely undeveloped, backward, if you like, means of production, especially in the rural area, very antiquated. And they're kept in that way by imperialist countries as well, scandalously. But on the other hand, imperialism also exports capital to those countries, builds factories in them, exploiting the extremely cheap labour that's to be found there. So you also tend to find a very concentrated working class, in some cases actually using very modern means of production, highly productive, and being very much classically working class, working in a communal or socialised manner, and with shared interests. So you have a very contradictory problem for those countries, because any revolution that breaks out, which does certainly tend to happen, on the one hand, they clearly aren't in a position to develop a sort of prosperous socialism. They're completely dependent on the world economy, on investment from other countries, the technology they found there, and exporting to those countries. But on the other hand, their working class, whenever it moves, whenever it organises itself to overthrow a regime, tends to kind of take power into their own hands. They tend to occupy their factories, they go on strike, they terrify the liberal bourgeoisie, if you like, in those countries, who then therefore tend to support the old regime, because at least that one guarantees their profits. So countries like that are faced with a conundrum that they can't solve in their own isolation. I mean, nor can any country really. Well, if Britain had a socialist revolution and wasn't joined by any other country in that, we too would ultimately suffer some kind of political degeneration, a decline in democracy. Because the only way you can maintain socialist democracy, if you like, workers' democracy, is through workers having the time and the sort of economic well-being to participate in running society. And even Britain is thoroughly dependent on the world economy. The vast majority of what we consume is not from Britain. So each and every country faces this problem. We need world revolution, but of course it won't take place unanimously in every country. That's why we strive for the building of a revolutionary international, which, for example, I am part of the International Marxist Tendency, which has, sections in about 30 or 40 countries around the world. And that's the great lesson of the Russian Revolution, because they were like a backward and impoverished country with a very destitute peasantry, with no ability to establish socialism on their own accounts. But unfortunately, there wasn't a genuine revolutionary international when they took power. So the socialist parties in other countries like Germany were thoroughly reformist. The leaderships had no interest in overthrowing capitalism. So they did have revolutions, which were inspired by the Russian Revolution, but they didn't take power. And that led to the isolation of that revolution. So the great lesson from that is that we need to build revolutionary parties in every country that are linked up internationally and coordinated. We need basically one world party of revolution. I think that answers the question about what plans the Marxists have. Well, we are involved, my organisation is involved, in building up its forces and educating more and more people around the world in Marxist ideas. And obviously we're a very small minority at the moment in most countries. However, it was always the way that the most ardent revolutionaries were in the minority. Not because workers are against revolution, really, but just that they take the line of least resistance. The first time they attempt to change society, they don't jump to the conclusion of revolutionary socialism immediately. Our role, therefore, has to be to continuously build up our forces, to educate ourselves, to steel ourselves in the history of the movement, in the mistakes that have been made before, etc., and to intervene in all real processes, despite all of their flaws, despite the confused character that many mass movements around the world's leadership has, in my opinion. We have to intervene in them, help them, and also develop a Marxist critique of the leaderships of these movements. And that's the only way that Marxists can build up their forces and escape from being a small minority and actually gain a greater echo. And I think in this period, Marxist ideas are extremely relevant to the world situation with the capitalist crisis, which is ongoing. They talk about 20 years of austerity. And not only that, but are actually very appealing when explained properly. Of course, many times so-called Marxists completely confuse and scare people with their kind of way of putting themselves across. We have to present ourselves in a sober and rational way, and patiently argue for our ideas with a friendly attitude to the other tendencies in society and in the workers' movement. And in that way win the confidence of people. And basically Marxists believe that a revolution has to be organised by the working class themselves, has to be run by the workers. We don't aim to sort of impose a revolution onto people, but merely to win the confidence of people who want a revolution for this particular kind of policy, of nationalising the means of production, of ending capitalism. But we believe that the workers do that themselves once they have understood the necessity for it. And that is what took place in the Russian Revolution in 1917, a growing realisation amongst the people that in order to end the war, in order to end the injustices of society, they needed to take power themselves and actually run society themselves by the workers and take over the factories and run them collectively and democratically. And that's what the Bolsheviks had been advocating for consistently, and eventually, because of that, and they convinced the masses, they were able to lead the masses, the working class, into taking power. However, as we explained, of course, in isolation and in dire economic circumstances, they effectively lost power, and power was usurped by the Stalinists. On to the question of trade unions. Marx was always consistently supportive of trade unions. He never argued in any way against trade unions, and he understood that it's the day-to-day struggle for reforms under capitalism, for more fairness, if you like, that binds the working class together, that raises it to its feet, that gives it the experience that it needs. Because if we're going to run society, if workers are going to run society, they can't just do that overnight, right? You're oppressed, you're passive under capitalism, and then you're supposed to just have a revolution and the next day know how to run society. No, so workers need to organise themselves, which they certainly do. All of history, I mean, you look at any capitalist country, there are mass trade unions, apart from in the most oppressive regimes. So there's an inherent tendency of the workers to organise trade unions. And as Mo said, I don't think as Marxists we can afford to alienate ourselves from that process just because it always has an inadequate political expression. I mean, it's inevitable that workers their own organisations will tend to, most of the time, have a reformist or a non-revolutionary leadership. Partly because workers themselves take the line of least resistance, they don't immediately jump to the most revolutionary of conclusions. But also because of the vicissitudes and the complexities of organising unions. Now one union is rising, but the other union is declining. One section of the workers have faced defeat, they don't know how to understand it, their leadership draws the conclusion that, well, we have to accept capitalism. It's a very complicated process with many contradictions involved. Workers don't sort of unanimously decide collectively at once, well, we need socialism. It's a complicated process and always a contradictory one. Some sections of workers are more conscious than others, are more class conscious. They believe they're much more aware of capitalism and the capitalist class. Others are not so much. It's the duty of those that are more conscious to win over the ones that are less conscious of the realities of capitalism. And one of the main arenas for that is inevitably in the trade unions. You are, however, I think, right in that trade unions do exhibit an inherent tendency towards reformism because ultimately they're defensive organisations and they're not political organisations. So everyone has to have the right to join a trade union. If you have a workplace, if the trade union is to be effective, you can't exclude someone who's a bit right-wing in some respects. If they want to join with you in a strike to increase their wages, you don't say, yeah, but you can't join in because you've got some stupid opinions about capitalism or something. Everyone has to be involved, but a political party is different. A political party obviously is one that has some degree of political agreement in its membership and fights for a very set programme. So a political party should therefore intervene in the trade unions amongst the various other tendencies that are in the trade unions, the more reformist, the more conservative, etc. And we would anticipate that generally speaking, the trade union leadership always will have a conservative side to it and a reformist side to it. And that's why we disagree with anarcho-syndicalists who believe that because they're anarchists and they're against political leadership, they come to the conclusion that the trade unions are the sort of authentic expression of the working class, and therefore only they have the authority to represent workers, and therefore any revolution has to just sort of happen purely through the trade unions. We would say that that's completely unrealistic. It's been disproven by history. Trade unions are a very important school for workers. They bring workers together, give them experience, but they don't generally have a revolutionary leadership, and even where they do, they're still not political parties. The role of a political party is to generalise the whole experience of the working class, not just of this section, not just of the steel workers or something, and to sort of, participate in political processes in the whole of society. So you would always need the political element. But anyway, that's basically our view of trade unions. I would expect in China that independent trade unions would be one of the first things Chinese workers would set up after a revolution. I'm not talking about before a revolution, I'm talking about if you have the toppling of the Communist Party, which I don't expect to lead to a socialist regime. I don't think that, as soon as, let's say you have a mass outbreak of opposition to the communist leadership, and a sort of communist inverted commas, obviously, and millions of people on the streets, and eventually the regime falling, because of the complete lack of political freedom in China, you don't have alternative political tendencies forming. So you won't have some sort of finished revolutionary socialist party able to sort of win the leadership of the movement overnight, and therefore create a socialist regime after the revolution. That won't happen. You'll have a toppling of the regime, a general confusion in society, and some sort of probably bourgeois opportunists attempting to take advantage of it and coming to power, like you saw in Egypt and Tunisia and things like that. But in doing so, they will open up an enormous opportunity for workers to organise themselves freely, to express their own views, to fight for higher wages and other reforms that they need. And of course, that may have a rather confused character, a reformist character, for example. But that will be an enormously progressive development for Chinese workers, to be able to discuss in freedom, to organise themselves in freedom. And therefore, revolutionaries would also have the ability to go to trade unions, to go to their conferences, to go to trade union meetings and advocate for a socialist programme. And in doing so, obviously build up bit by bit the prestige, the authority, the integrity of socialists in China, which at the moment, a lot of Chinese people sympathise with socialist ideas, but they don't have any means of expressing that. So yes, independent trade unions I think would be inevitable and a big step forward. And actually they do form independent trade unions in China now, but they have a very fleeting existence. Why would a revolution today be more successful than in the past for China? That was what you asked. Well, as I just said, I don't think the sort of first phase of a revolution in China, if it were to break out in the next few years, which it very, very well could do, I don't believe it would be successful from a socialist point of view, but it would be inevitable and necessary. We can't skip to socialism to a great democratic socialist regime without going through a complicated process of learning, and that involves confused political processes, involves toppling the regime but not having anything clear to replace it with. It's unfortunate, but history shows that that's the way things tend to happen. However, there is one big reason why the potential for successful socialism in China is there today in a way that it wasn't in 1949, and that's that China is an enormously developed country now, although okay, it still has a big peasantry, but it's got the biggest working class in the world, some of the most important industry in the world, very high degree of productivity in the industrial centres. So the strength of workers to organise themselves, to run society through their production, to raise living standards. As I said, there's a lot of unused factories in China because they can't, sell their goods. Well, they could open those up, open all the closed factories, use all their technology and know-how to raise the living standards in China, rather than increasing the wealth of the very top 1% or so. And the impact of a revolution in China on the rest of the world would be absolutely monumental. This is the biggest working class in the world, the one that produces more manufactured goods than any other country, the one that all of the rest of the world depends on for its cheap commodities. So a kind of a liberation of the Chinese masses and the building of a regime that was fighting for equality and trying to raise the living standard of the masses and giving them a voice. That regime would have enormous attraction throughout the world. The reverberations of it would be tremendous. So the ability of such a revolution to break out of isolation, basically, would be absolutely immense. And I mean, the revolution in 1949, I don't have time to go into in any length, but it was, from a Marxist point of view, quite a strange revolution, because it didn't take place through the working class at all, but through a sort of peasant army in the countryside, which then came to power by surrounding the cities and then invading them. The workers were pretty much completely passive part of the process, whereas in sort of classic Marxist view of revolution, and as confirmed in many other countries, revolutionary movements tend to originate in the urban centres and involve the self-organisation of working class people. The establishment of workplace committees, of local committees to express your point of view and defend yourselves and things like that. Now, you didn't have that at all in China. That was partly because of the peasant nature of China, of course, which is much less the case now. But it's also because of the very peculiar way in which the Chinese Communist Party developed under Stalin's mistaken policies, basically. And thankfully, we don't have Stalinism today. We don't have Stalin controlling the world communist movement. And therefore, I think any development of a socialist movement in China would be one that was a very genuine one from below. Innovated by the movement of the masses, rather than a sort of a very bureaucratically controlled one from above. And that would also obviously bode very well for developing a socialism and workers' democracy. Regarding the question of autonomous regions in China and the Marxist view of the right to self-determination, well, Marxists in general, and this is my view, are in favour of the right to self-determination for oppressed countries, oppressed nationalities. And obviously, in my view, Tibet and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is a case in point. They are definitely oppressed, and I think the fact that they're called autonomous regions is a bit of an insult to the Uyghurs and the Tibetans that live there, who've had their rights trampled on and don't really see the fruits of the economic development, which generally go to Han Chinese people who move into those areas. However, I wouldn't advocate self-determination for those countries. I advocate the right to it, and if a movement were to break out amongst Tibetans or amongst Uyghurs for independence from China, and if I were a Marxist there, I would certainly support that. Not in the sense I would advocate independence, but I would participate in it, because inevitably in such a movement, you don't just have nationalist desires, you also have working class and peasant desires for economic kind of betterment, for freedom, etc. And as a Marxist, that's something you have to support and something you have to fight alongside of. However, I would not advocate independence for those countries because I don't believe in nationalism, basically, and I don't think Marxists do believe in national solutions. We believe in class-based approaches. And it's difficult because, Tibet is an extremely impoverished and undeveloped area, as is Xinjiang, and what development there is there generally goes around the indigenous people, basically, right? So generally speaking, Tibetans and Uyghurs are not working class. They're generally nomadic people in the case of Tibet, or petty bourgeois types, or impoverished, or even just generally unemployed people. So unfortunately, they're not likely to be a big part of any kind of working class movement. So the example is a bit different to, say, Scotland, where clearly a lot of Scottish people are working class. And therefore you can advocate quite effectively the solidarity and the unity of English and Scottish workers against the general enemy, which is British capitalism, not just English people in general. But that would be a little bit harder in the case of those areas because of their impoverishment, but nevertheless, that's the approach I would take. Actually, interestingly, Mao, before he came to power, had quite an intelligent approach when they were in the countryside fighting the war against the Kuomintang, because their approach when they were in Muslim and Tibetan areas was to go to the local the tribal people, who they generally were, not sort of working class people, and say to them, look, you see us as oppressors, you see us as Han Chinese, right? But actually, we are oppressed by the Han Chinese too. we are fighting for oppression of the poor people, of the whole country, and that includes you. So we will fight alongside you for your freedom, and if you want to separate from China, we will support that too. However, we think it would be better if you would fight alongside us in solidarity. We won't force you to do so, it's voluntary. But if you want to, we would advocate fighting side by side in a collective struggle against the ruling class of this country, which we are opposed to. And they actually had an enormous degree of success, especially amongst the Muslim people in places like is it Qingdao, Gansu, that kind of area, I think, where there was lots of Muslim people. And it was quite successful. However, when they came to power, they, because of their sort of Stalinist nature, they went the complete opposite way and started oppressing them. Now, I don't really have time to go into the reasons for that. But that approach is the correct approach from a Marxist point of view. You should have a friendly attitude towards nationally oppressed peoples, if you're not in that group. And do your best to show that you support their right to freedom. You in no way are a national chauvinist opposed to their freedom. But at the same time, it would be better for both of you if you joined together in a fight against the common enemy. And that's really the best approach from a revolutionary point of view. And the role of xenophobia, this obviously goes into this question quite well. Yes, this is used as a big distraction by the Chinese ruling class, and it is a danger to the working class. And if I were an activist in China, I would warn against any nationalist tendencies which distract them from the real enemy, which is at home, which is the Chinese ruling class. However, it's very complicated. It's not quite as simple as that, because where you have seen riots against the Japanese, for example, recently over the Senkaku Islands, and the burning of Toyota cars and things like that, actually there was a class element to that as well. And as Marxists, we always have to endeavour to penetrate beneath the surface appearance of things, which is generally controlled by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie tries to give it a veneer of national, the Chinese people fighting against the Japanese. But look beneath the surface and look at the real forces involved. In some of those riots and in some of those movements, you also had the Chinese people, working class people, saw an opportunity to express their own grievances, not just against the Japanese, but also against their own ruling class, who they see as actually in cahoots with the Japanese capitalists, which is actually true. So they would carry on these demonstrations, yes, placards against Japan, which is also quite a legitimate thing in a certain sense, because of course Japan is and was an imperialist country. But also alongside that, they were carrying class-based demands against their own regime, for higher wages and things like that. And in some cases, they took advantage of the sort of legitimised anti-Japanese kind of character of the situation to stage strikes in Japanese-owned factories. Ostensibly, obviously, that's an anti-Japanese thing, so that's okay. But actually, they were strikes, class-based movements, not really national ones, but class-based movements against exploitation. There are many Japanese factories in China that exploit Chinese people very ruthlessly, and I'm sure do exhibit a lot of racism and a sort of a snobbish attitude towards the Chinese people there. So we also have to see there's a very reactionary character to the overall sort of movement which the Chinese state encourages, but also at the same time the oppressed people use it as an opportunity. Of course, it doesn't mean they don't also have some silly xenophobic views which we're opposed to and we fight against. But they also have very legitimate grievances. And we have to tap into that, we have to fight alongside it and make a distinction between the two. So if I were there, I would fight in that and I would support those strikes. But I would argue in them against any kind of elements of racism or nationalism. But it certainly is a danger. However, I don't think it will go the way of Russia. Certainly you can imagine after a revolution, a sort of polarisation in society and the crystallisation of a kind of nationalist, left over from the Communist Party, a sort of bourgeois nationalist element, and a left-wing element maybe splitting away from the Communist Party, and a sort of, maybe like a neo-Maoist kind of movement that attempted to sort of appeal to the workers. And the difference with Russia is that the way in which capitalism was introduced in Russia, and which gave rise to someone like Putin and his horrible regime, was in a disastrous way for the working class. It had the biggest peacetime collapse in GDP of any country, I think, in history, which showed how a reactionary step the reintroduction of capitalism was. And has led to this kind of very oppressed working class with no real sort of organisation, with a sort of completely hopeless communist party, and the complete domination of Putin and his nationalism. But in China, I think the workers are building up their confidence gradually. Capitalism has been introduced gradually, not in this sort of shock tactic kind of way. And the Chinese workers are increasing their level of organisation and confidence. So I think the ability of a sort of right-wing nationalist element to sort of monopolise the political situation could be limited by a movement by the workers from below. But these are all, perspectives. We don't know exactly how it will play out. But certainly the nationalist element is there and will be used very much and plays a reactionary role. And as Marxists, we have to fight against that. So the final thing I wanted to come on to is this question of Deng Xiaoping, and also what would the would you have neo-Maoism or Trotskyism in China if there were a sort of development of a left tendency in workers? Well, first of all, with Deng, I think around the time of Deng was expressing a necessary move by the Chinese bureaucracy if it wanted to maintain its political monopoly. Because, as Barbara pointed out, it didn't just sort of, he didn't just come to power himself, he represented a big tendency within the Chinese Communist Party. He was actually banished, really, from any position of authority in the party, probably because he was advocating a pro-capitalist course, which Mao opposed. It's the fact that he was relegated in the ranks of the Communist Party, and then able to rise up rapidly within 2 years of Mao's death to be the leader, the president of China, shows that he must have represented a very powerful and serious faction in the party. And it was no accident that that was the case. It was because they saw, look, socialism as they saw it isn't really working. It's not working in Russia either. And the shift in world politics generally was moving to the right in the late 80s, hence people like Thatcher and Reagan, and in the late 70s. And they thought, well, we need to get investment from abroad. We need to get the know-how and technique of multinational corporations. They weren't necessarily trying to introduce capitalism. They were perhaps just trying to, spur the economy on. It was inevitable that course would be taken sooner or later, unless, and this is the alternative that Marxists oppose, because Marxists, as much as genuine Marxists are against Stalinism, we're not in favour of the collapse of those regimes into capitalist ones. We would argue for the introduction of workers' democracy, but the maintenance of the planned economy. So if we had been active in China in the 1970s, that was the alternative we would oppose, not the opening up of capitalism and the enrichment of the bureaucracy thereby, but the opening up of the economy to workers' democracy, which would both obviously liberate workers and create a much more sort of progressive environment, but it would also massively develop the economy, because in Stalinist regimes, we all know about the bureaucracy, the stagnation, the corruption, the black market, the lack of productivity. But why does that take place? It's not because a planned economy is inherently like that. In fact, quite on the contrary, capitalism actually has all kinds of fetters and obstacles to the development of the means of production and wealth. From patent laws, to just the shuttering of large parts of the economy because you can't sell things at a profitable rate. We know that. But unfortunately, Stalinism is a planned economy without any democratic checks and balances, so that bureaucrats really can kind of make economic decisions that have no real reference to the needs of society. They can do things like carrying out an order to produce a few million boots, which has been given from above, but they just produce only left boots, because it's easier for them to fulfill their kind of, their box-ticking exercise as a bureaucrat. They don't care whether or not that's useful. Of course, it's completely useless if you only have the left-sided shoe or boot in the economy. Capitalism also has these kind of problems with bureaucracy, but there's a check on it from the market. If you're a shoe manufacturer and you produce only left-sided or right-sided shoes, you're not going to sell many shoes, and that's obvious. And if you do have a stupid and very poor quality product, which many firms do, eventually you'll probably go out of business, right? So that, in a very kind of chaotic and anarchic manner, it does create a check and balance on the economy. Of course, we're in favour of getting rid of the market, but we need to replace that with a different check and balance, which is genuine democracy of workers and not consumers, who would see at the point of production, this is ridiculous, why are we producing only left-sided shoes? It's only the bureaucrats who just have an interest in sort of box ticking and sort of fulfilling their quota, you know, and therefore by getting a promotion in their career. It's only they who would have that approach, but workers and consumers, if given democratic control, if able to elect managers in their factory and recall them at any time, and if able to participate in democratic conferences to determine what should and shouldn't be produced, they would obviously make sure, because they are the people in general, that, you know, stupid economic decisions are not taken. And that would be the kind of policy that we would have proposed for China. Obviously that's gone now, so we would have to advocate full-scale revolution against the capitalism in China. And if that were to take place, what kind of tendency will we see? Will we be neo-Maoism, Trotskyism, or something like that? Well, it's rather complicated, and I think China is an extremely large country, so in a revolution, you would have a whole swathe of tendencies developing amongst the working class and students and other people like that. You would have some Trotskyist people developing an organisation, getting some support for their ideas, and you have many other confused kinds. But I think the main kind you would see, most likely, in the workers' movement, maybe some kind of neo-Maoism. But as much as I'm not a Maoist, I would see that as a progressive thing. I wouldn't see it as a return to Maoism. For many Chinese people, Maoism, you know, they don't really mean like, let's, you know, return to the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. What they mean is basically, let's go back to socialism. Let's stop the corruption, let's stop the inequality, let's stop the privatisation. And that's really what a neo-Maoist organisation would probably be advocating in some way. I think it would probably be rather have a confused programme, but nevertheless a generally progressive one, which I would have to support, although also be, you know, have critical support on. I mean, I don't know, but I'd imagine something like that is likely. You saw that in Egypt after the revolution, that a very popular, I think they came second or third in the presidential poll. Some people think they came first, but it was possibly rigged in favour of the Muslim Brotherhood. But anyway, in that election, there was a person who became officially third, was what he called a neo-Nasserite. And Nasser was a kind of Mao-type figure for Egypt, you know, a sort of left-wing nationalist who nationalised the Suez Canal and other industries, attempted to sort of create some democratic and progressive reforms. He was also a dictator, and, you know, many problems with his programme. But in the eyes of an Egyptian worker, that represents an attack against capitalism, against corruption, against all of the disgusting kind of inequalities that they have today. So it's not to say that that person is really the same as Nasser. He just represents a sort of harking back to the existing traditions and established ideas. And I think that's probably what, at least in the first phase of the development of an independent workers' movement in China, that's probably what you would see. And I would, as a Marxist, support that, advocate getting involved with it if I were in China. But I would also criticise the inevitable kind of shortcomings and confusions that probably such a movement's leadership would have. Anyway, yeah, I have to sum up, so I'll finish there.
All right, thanks for coming, everyone.